Ned was very angry about this. "It isn't right," he said. "Why do the police do this? Because our friends are poor farmers, not rich ones, and because they help us. We must stop the police." "But how?" said Steve. "What can we do?" "Two things," said Ned. "First, we need more money, so we must visit a bank. And second, we tell everybody in Australia about the police here in Victoria." "Rob another bank?" Dan said. "But the police are watching all the banks now." "Yes, in Victoria," said Ned. "But not in New South Wales, so we're going to a bank in Jerilderie. Here's the plan. There are only 2 policemen in Jerilderie. We arrive at night, go to the police station, and lock the policemen in the station. Then we rob the bank and go to the office of Jerilderie's newspaper." "The newspaper office?" said Dan. "Why? What for?" "To print this," said Joe. "Look, it's Ned's letter to the world. I wrote it down for him. It tells the true story about Ned and his family, about the police, about Stringy Bark Creek, about everything. We want everybody to read this letter, but how do we give it to them?" Ned said. "We must print it in a newspaper. It's the only way." Ned planned the Jerilderie visit very carefully. There were now more than 200 policemen in the northeast of Victoria because of the Kelly gang, and Ned asked his friend Aaron Sherritt for help. So Aaron went drinking with a policeman. Money passed from one hand to another, and Aaron spoke quietly in the policeman's ear. "Go to Corryong. The gang are planning to cross the Murray River near there very soon." So the police rode east to Corryong, and the Kelly gang rode west and crossed the river 200 kilometers away. And late on a Saturday night in February 1879, they rode into the town of Jerilderie. Outside the police station, Ned began to shout, "Help! Help! There's a big fight at the hotel. We need help!" The 2 policemen ran out and saw the outlaws with their guns. The gang locked the policemen in a room in the station and took their uniforms. For the next 2 days, the gang lived in the police station. On Sunday, Joe and Steve put on the police uniforms and walked around the town. "We're the new policemen for Jerilderie," they told everyone. They went past the bank and the hotel next to it and looked carefully at all the doors, front and back. Then on Monday morning, Dan and Steve went into the hotel next to the bank and took out their guns. They took all the hotel workers into one room. "Don't move," said Dan. "You're our hostages, but don't be afraid. We don't want to shoot anybody." Ned and Joe went into the bank through the back door. When they came back to the hotel, they had more hostages, 2 bank workers and all the people from the bank. And Ned had the bank's money, 21 to 40 pounds. There were now about 60 hostages in the room, and Ned began to speak to them. "What's happening in this country? Do you know? No, you don't. So listen, poor men get poorer and rich men get richer. The police help the rich farmers and put the poor farmers in prison. Why? For nothing. Do you call this justice? There is no justice in Australia. The police say we are killers, but I say the police are killers. I'm going to tell you about Stringy Bark Creek, the true story, not the police story." Ned began to read to the hostages from his letter. It was a long letter, 56 pages, and more than 75,000 words. After a few pages, he stopped. "Where's the newspaper office in this town?" he said. "I want to print this letter. Then everybody can read it." Edwin Living, one of the bank workers, answered. "Mr. Gill is the editor of the newspaper," he said. "I know his house. I can take you there." "Come on, then," Ned said. But Mr. Gill was not at home. He was at a farm 10 kilometers away. When he heard the Kelly gang were in town, he ran away because he was afraid of them. At the house, Mrs. Gill opened the door. "Where's your husband?" Ned asked. I don't know. He's away," Mrs. Gill said. Ned looked at her angrily and took out his letter. "I want him to print this in his newspaper," he said. "Give it to me," said Edwin Living. "I can give it to Mr. Gill when he gets back." "He must print it," said Ned. "It's about my life, and I want the world to read it." "Yes," said Edwin, "everybody must read it, and Mr. Gill's going to print it, for sure, Mr. Kelly." "He must," Ned said. "All right, you give it to him, but do it, or the next time I come to Jerilderie." They went back to the hotel, and Ned had a drink with the hostages. Then the 4 outlaws rode out of town, back to the Murray River, and across into Victoria and the hills in the northeast. The police looked everywhere. They made the reward £8,000, but nobody came to get it. Nobody wanted to help them. In Jerilderie, people laughed about the visit of the Kelly gang. In April, Ned's friends came out of prison and went back to their farms. And for 16 months, the police heard nothing of the Kelly gang. And Ned's letter, the famous Jerilderie letter? Edwin Living did not give it to Mr. Gill. He went down to Melbourne and gave it to the police. Nobody saw the letter again for 50 years. Chapter 5. Alive or Dead at Glenrowan, June, 1880. The Kelly gang are living in the hills. Their friends bring them food, but life is hard, and the police are still making trouble. They don't put the Kelly's friends in prison now, but they stop them buying land. And why? Because they are friends of the Kelly gang. "We must do something," Ned said, "to help our friends. We need a new country, a country for poor people, with good police and good judges. But it's not going to happen easily. We must fight for it." "We need money for that," said Joe. "A lot of money. And there's a policeman with a gun at every bank now." "We need armor to go over our heads and bodies," Ned said. "Bullets can't get through armor." "How are we going to get armor?" asked Dan. "We can make it," said Ned. And they did. With help from their friends, they made 4 suits of armor from old farm machinery. Then they began to plan their fight. "Our friends want to help," Ned said. "They have guns, and they want to fight with us. So we need to bring a lot of policemen to one place. How can we do that?" "With a killing," said Joe. "We kill Aaron Sherritt. He's working for the police. He tells them everything about us. You know it, I know it, everybody knows it. He was a friend once, but now he wants to see us dead." "Yes, that's true," Ned said. "We hear it from everybody. So you go to Aaron's house at Beechworth and shoot him. You and Dan." "Right," said Dan. "And then when the Beechworth police hear about the killing, they know it's us, the Kelly gang. So they ask for help from the police at Benalla." "And the Benalla police take the train to Beechworth," said Steve. "Lots of police all in one train." "And we," Ned said quietly, "are waiting for the train at Glenrowan." The plan began well. Joe and Dan rode to Beechworth. When Aaron Sherritt opened his door on Saturday, 26th of June, Joe shot him at once. Then the 2 outlaws rode 60 kilometers across country to Glenrowan. News of the killing went down to Benalla. Ned and Steve arrived at Glenrowan Inn on Saturday afternoon. They began to bring hostages into the inn. People from the railway station, railway workers, people from the town. Then Ned took some of the railway workers to the hill just past the railway station. "Take up the railway line," he told them. "Go on." "We can't do that," one worker said. "Do you want to kill everybody on the next train?" Then he saw Ned's gun and asked no more questions. The workers took up 3 meters of railway line and went back to the inn with Ned. Joe and Dan were there now, and some of the gang's friends. Other friends, about 30 men, stayed near the railway line. In the inn, there was a lot of drinking that night. On Sunday morning, Ned found more hostages. The schoolteacher, Thomas Curnow, with his young wife, baby, and sister. There were now 62 hostages in the inn, and everybody waited for the police train. The police moved very slowly. In Beechworth, Benalla, and Melbourne they talked, made plans, and talked some more. In the end, a police train left Melbourne late on Sunday evening. And that evening, Ned told about 20 of the hostages. "You can go home." Later, the school teacher came to him. "Can I take my family home?" he asked. "Don't be afraid of me. You know I'm a friend of the Kellys." "Yes, you can go," said Ned. Thomas Curnow was a brave man. He took his young family home and later went quietly out into the night and along the railway line. At 3 o'clock in the morning he heard the train and held up a red light. "Stop! Stop!" he cried. At the inn, Ned and the gang heard the train too. They listened, but there was no noise of a crash, no train falling through the trees, no cries and shouts. "What's happening?" Steve said. "Nothing," said Ned. "Somebody stopped the train before it got to the broken rails. Put your armor on, boys, and get ready to fight." The gang went out to the front of the inn. They began to fire at the police, and the police fired back. Bullets went everywhere. 3 of the hostages inside the inn died. The police shot Ned in the arm and the foot, and Joe in the leg. "Go back into the inn," Ned said to the gang. "I must find our friends. They must get away from here." The gang's friends were near the railway line. "We want to fight, Ned," they said. "Take us with you." "No, no, you must get away," said Ned. "The plan for the train went wrong, and there are police everywhere. This is our fight. You can't help us. Go." Back at the inn, the shooting did not stop. The hostages, many of them women and children, were on the floor, their faces white and afraid. Joe was in the front room with a drink in his hand. "I drink to the Kelly gang," he cried. Then a bullet came through the wall and hit him. He died at once. The wounds in Ned's arm and foot were bad, and in the trees he fell to the ground. A friend tried to help him, but for some hours Ned could not move. Then slowly he stood up, and in his armor began to walk back to the inn. His brother Dan and Steve Hart were still inside the inn, and Ned went back to help them. In the early morning light, he came slowly out of the trees, his gun in his hand. 1 man against 34 policemen. They fired and fired at him, but the bullets hit Ned's armor, and Ned laughed. "Go on, fire! You can't kill me," he called. But there was no armor on Ned's legs. One of the policemen saw this and fired, once, twice. The bullets hit Ned's legs, and he fell slowly to the ground. At once the police were all around him. He was alive, but only just, and they carried him to the railway station. Soon after this, the last hostages left Glenrowan Inn. Only Dan and Steve were still inside, but the police did not stop firing at the building. Later on that Monday morning, a second train arrived in Glenrowan with more police, photographers, and newspaper men. There were now more than 1,000 people in the town. And down south, in Melbourne, hundreds of people waited in the streets for news of the Kelly gang. On Monday afternoon, Ned's sisters, Maggie and Kate, arrived in Glenrowan. They heard the news about Ned and then asked for news of Dan. "Maggie, tell your brother and Steve Hart to put down their guns and come out of the inn," said a policeman. "Tell them to stop fighting?" "Never," said Maggie. Maggie and Kate did not see Dan alive again. The police were afraid to go into the inn, but they did not want Dan and Steve to get away in the night, so they set fire to the building. Old buildings burned fast, and when Maggie and Kate got to the inn, the sky was red with fire. "Dan! Oh, Dan!" Maggie called out again and again. "My poor, poor brother!" Kate cried. Glenrowan Inn burnt down to the ground. When the fire was cold, they took out the dead bodies of Dan Kelly, Steve Hart, and Joe Byrne. Ned was alive, but in prison. It was the end of the Kelly gang. Chapter 6, Ned's Last Days. July, 1880. The police take Ned Kelly to Benalla, then to Melbourne Prison. There is a lot of waiting and talking and more talking. The police talk, the judges talk, Ned talks, but the ending is always the same. At the end of October, Ned went before his last judge, Sir Redmond Barry, in Melbourne. For 2 days, Judge Barry listened to the police, listened to Ned, read the police papers, and thought about it. But he didn't think long. There were a lot of dead policemen in Ned Kelly's life, and there was only one answer to that. Ned Kelly must die. Hang him in the prison. Hang him by the neck until he is dead. A lesson to every outlaw in Australia. Ned's mother, Ellen, was still in Melbourne Prison. When they told her the news, she cried. She cried for her dead son, Dan, and she cried for her son, Ned, alive, but waiting to die. They took her to see Ned on his last day alive. What did mother and son talk about that day? Ned's sisters and brother worked hard to help him. "How can they do this?" said Maggie angrily. "How can they hang poor Ned? What did the police do to him? Why don't the judges think about that?" "Shh, Maggie," said Jim. "No time for that now. We must get out there and talk to the people in the town." And so they did. They went all round Melbourne, to all the hotels, talking to everybody. "They're going to hang Ned Kelly. What do you think about that?" they asked. "It's not right," said one man. "Why do they want to hang him?" a second man said. "Because he killed a policeman?" "No, because he helps poor people and gives them money, that's why." "But what can we do?" asked a third man. "Put your names on our petition," was the answer. There were more than 32,000 names on the Kelly petition, but the petition changed nothing. So the last visitors came to see Ned on the 10th of November, and he ate his last dinner. Then he sang for half an hour and went to bed. Next morning they took Ned across the prison to a room with a rope. Outside the prison more than 5,000 people waited, men and women, rich and poor. "Where's the Kelly family?" one woman asked. "Some of them are here at the hotel," was the answer. "But Maggie went back to Beechworth yesterday. She wanted to be with her children. And there's Ned's poor mother. She's in the prison too, waiting for 10 o'clock." Then the prisoners in Melbourne prison began to make a terrible noise, shouting and crying out and banging on their doors. And in her room, Ellen Kelly cried quietly for her oldest son. In the hotel, Jim Kelly sat with his head in his hands. "Poor Ned. This is the end of all his troubles," he said. And at 10 o'clock, the prison officers put the rope around Ned Kelly's neck and hanged him. Ned was dead, but in the Northeast, life went on. 68 people got money from the Kelly Gang reward. Schoolteacher Thomas Curnow got £1,000. A new man, Policeman Graham, came to Greta. He was a good policeman, and Ned's friends listened to him. "Don't make trouble, and then you can buy your farms," he told them. He went to 11 Mile Creek and had tea with Ellen Kelly. Everyone talked about that. Slowly, things began to change. The police tried to be more friendly, to help poor people, and not just the rich. Most of the young men stopped stealing